Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching.
They called it the Second Rome, a great city astride Europe and Asia. And its vast empire, which would preserve Greco-Roman culture and transmit it to the West, when Rome itself lay in barbarian hands. The Byzantine Empire, this time on the Western tradition.
And now UCLA professor Eugen Weber's continuing journey through the history of Western civilization.
The power of the Western Roman Empire lasted 5 centuries. The power of Babylon and Assyria rather less than that. The Persian Empire took 3 centuries before Alexander put an end to it, and the British Empire lasted about 2 centuries. But the Byzantine Empire survived longer than any of these. Only Egypt lasted longer. The word Byzantine comes from Byzantium, the old Greek city on the Bosphorus that became the site of Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Byzantines called their lands Romania, and they called themselves Romans, Romaioi. And their empire remained for many centuries the only civilized power in all of Europe. Just as we attribute the creation of the Roman Empire to Augustus, so we can attribute the creation of the Byzantine Empire, which was the Second Rome, to Constantine the Great, who transferred the empire's capital to the city that would bear his name, who made the empire a Christian empire, and the emperor into the anointed of the Lord. The Byzantine Empire copied and preserved much of the classical art and literature and Roman law, which we have inherited. And the empire's importance to Eastern Europe is even greater because it was Byzantine missionaries and Byzantine prestige that civilized and Christianized the Eastern Slavs from the Baltic to the Balkans and beyond. For example, this 11th century enamel medallion was made in Georgia, which is now part of the Soviet Union. Constantinople was inaugurated as an imperial capital of the Roman Empire in 330, and it survived until 1453, when the Turkish conquest put an end to one imperial tradition and began another, renaming the city Istanbul. But it was a remarkably long run while it lasted. During this more than 1,000 years, the Byzantines conquered and lost several empires. In the 6th century, a Balkan empire was recaptured from the Goths. A Mediterranean empire was built up after a long, hard-fought war, also against the Goths. And an African empire was reconquered from the Vandals. But the African empire and much of the Middle East were lost to the Arabs in the 7th century. Most of the Mediterranean empire was lost about the same time, with the remainder going in the 11th century, and the Balkan empire was lost and partly regained in the 9th century. The trouble with Constantinople, represented here as a classical figure, was that her tradition was Roman. You can tell this is Rome because of her helmet and military dress.
Constantinople's imperial vision was that of the old Roman Mediterranean Empire, which it was not well placed to run if you bear in mind the problems of time and scale that had proved too much even for Rome to handle. The average ship would take a week or two to cross the Mediterranean from north to south, 15 days from Constantinople to Alexandria. But it could take as much as 2 or 3 months from east to west, for example, from Crete to Carthage or Cadiz. So there were considerable obstacles to the realization of the Byzantines' imperial ambitions. In the 6th century, when the Emperor Justinian, seen here, regained Italy from the Goths and North Africa from Vandals, he exhausted the resources of Byzantium while also ruining Italy's economy and killing a large part of its population. So it was no accident that the Byzantine Empire reached its high point when it became smaller and more defensible between the 8th and 12th centuries. It had survived new waves of barbarian invasions, but equally important, it had lost its outlying possessions to the Arabs and the Slavs and had become more compact. Yet, whatever happened to its outlying empire, Constantinople remained what Paris was, what New York is today. The foremost city of luxury, fashion, and culture, also the city of sin, corruption, and material temptation, all of which, however you look at it, is no mean achievement. The city was built on a high peninsula on the Bosphorus, where Europe comes very close to the Asian shore. Astride both Europe and Asia, Constantinople was a crossroads par excellence. It commanded the route from the Caucasus and the steppes to the Mediterranean, and also the route from the Danube Valley to the Euphrates Valley. The Balkans were its backyard. Asia Minor lay just across the water, and beyond that Syria and Mesopotamia.
So Constantinople was perfectly situated to serve as the capital of a realm that bridged East and West, that connected Greco-Roman culture with Christianity and with Oriental civilization. And its history is indeed the bridge that links us with Egypt, which it came to rule, and with Persia, which it fought and finally defeated, and even with Alexander the Great, whose title of Basileus, or royal king, the Byzantines borrowed for their own rulers. For centuries, Constantinople was the repository of Greek and Roman culture and of the tradition that had been built up in preceding ages in Egypt and Babylon and Athens and Rome and Jerusalem. Our civilization wouldn't be the way it is today if the city of Constantine hadn't endured to transmit these traditions, to transmit the Latin of Rome and the Greek of Athens, the skills, the arts, the thought, the memories, to the barbarians of the West and to their gradually more civilized successors. So the survival of the city was crucial because it helped to make our past.
Perhaps the most important factor in its survival was the conviction that the empire was willed by God and protected by God and his anointed representatives. On the other hand, it was this same religious conviction that goes a long way to explain the traditionalism, the extreme conservatism of Byzantium. If your state is founded on the will of heaven, why innovate? A Byzantine ruler might be dethroned, and God knows enough of them were by murder as shown here, or palace revolutions or riots in the city. But a change of emperor did not mean a change of policy, except in minor details, because to change it would have been something like changing your faith. And so, with heaven's approval secure, the Byzantine sovereign and the Byzantine state were both defenders of the faith. The concentration of all authority in the hands of God's representative, like the emperor depicted here, was in itself a great source of strength. In the West, men lived their lives under a lot of different legal systems, tribal law, local law, manorial law, and the law of the central or would-be central state fought a continuous battle for recognition from the countryside, from the provinces, which took centuries and didn't really get settled until quite recent times. Here, for instance, are great landowners from 6th century Italy who were a law unto themselves. But in the East, there was only one law, and that Roman law emanated from a single source, the ruler. Even the decisions of the councils of the church needed the emperor's approval. This is what has been called Caesaro-papism, a political system in which the head of state is also master of the church. And the patriarch, the Bishop of Constantinople, lived in the shadow of the imperial palace.
When Constantine died in 337 with his heir far from Constantinople, the embalmed remains of the dead emperor continued to rule the empire through a whole summer and autumn and winter, with couriers reading their messages before it, ministers making reports to it, and courtiers seeking audience before it. It's important to realize, however, that even this macabre image of a ruling corpse had its roots in a long past. It was simply the triumph of the Hellenistic view of the emperor's lofty position, a view which had developed in the East since the days of Alexander, which the Romans had taken some time to adopt, but which the Emperor Diocletian explicitly claimed in Rome at the end of the 3rd century. And it was very useful, because it lent the Byzantine Empire a sort of authority and stability that the old unified empire never had.
It did not matter anymore whether the emperor was elected, or if he was born to the purple, or if he seized power, because his throne rested upon more solid foundations than worldly processes could ensure. He was the anointed of the Lord, chosen from birth to fulfill the will of heaven. And since Byzantines believed that promotion to rule came solely from God, the imperial throne was open to everybody, peasant and noble, to scholars and to unlearned men, the only condition being that the ruler should be an Orthodox Christian. Leo I in the 5th century had been a butcher. People in Constantinople used to point out the stall where he and his wife had sold meat. Justin I in the 6th century was a poor swineherd from the countryside who first appeared in the capital with bare feet and a pack on his back. And then one day his nephew left the family village to join him. His name was Justinian, and he became emperor in 527. Phocas, who ruled in the 7th century, was a simple centurion. Leo III in the 8th century was an odd job man. Basil I in the 9th century was a peasant, probably a shepherd from Macedonia. And Michael IV in the 11th century was a servant from Paphlagonia on the Black Sea.
But once a man had become emperor, there was no constitutional method by which he could be deposed except a successful revolution. And here again, the fact of success set the seal of heavenly approval upon the man who, had he failed, would have been a mere usurper and would have been punished in the most terrible ways. The Byzantines knew that Jehovah had transferred his favor from Saul to David. They believed that God could withdraw his support from any ruler, and then you would know it, because the ruler would fall. And with this belief, revolution itself was incorporated into the body of constitutional practices. As the German historian Mommsen said, Roman government was an autocracy tempered by the legal right of revolution.
Out of 88 emperors who ruled in Byzantium through 11 centuries, over 1/3 would be usurpers, and as many died in violent circumstances. Poisoned, stabbed, strangled, beheaded, starved, tortured to death, or simply blinded, which was considered more humane. As one result, it became particularly important to emphasize the sanctity of the emperor, his distance, his untouchableness. The more vulnerable the emperor in fact, the greater the efforts to make him appear invulnerable in principle. This is Constantius II and his empress, who ruled in the 4th century. This is when the empire is most threatened, in their time and throughout the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries. And this is when the personal position of the emperor is least secure. This is when the imperial ceremonies stiffen and the distance grows between the ruler and his subjects. A spectacular, megalomaniac kind of drama is devised both to enhance power and to make up for the shortcomings in this power. You can see this if you look at the mosaics of the Emperor Justinian and the Empress Theodora. Stiff and splendid in the midst of their courtiers, their posture reminiscent of the unmoved mover, the highest power in the cosmos. Although it was very important that the emperor should impress upon his subjects this feeling of divinity which might help to preserve him from an undignified end, it was equally important that he should impress the barbarians, friend or foe. This was rather more feasible because barbarians were less sophisticated. So imagine the arrival in Constantinople of a barbarian chieftain from the steppes, from the desert, or even from the underdeveloped countries in Western Europe. He finds himself in this terrific maze of streets and concentrated humanity. He is taken over by imperial officials who look after him every day, every hour, who show him the sights, and who finally take him to the palace for an audience with the emperor.
To get to the throne room, he passes through a sort of palace of the Wizard of Oz, through a maze of marble corridors and chambers rich with mosaic and cloth of gold, through long lines of palace guards in white uniforms, through great crowds of patricians, bishops, senators, and all of this to the music of organs and church choirs, with eunuchs on either side of him holding him under the armpits, until at last he enters the octagonal room where this silent, stiff, completely motionless figure is seated on an elevated throne veiled by purple fabrics, purple being the imperial color and forbidden to everybody else. The furniture of the room is very strange. There are golden lions, golden griffins, golden birds perched on golden trees, rather like a sort of glorified mechanical toy store gone wild. And all of this is set in motion by the chieftain's entrance. The animals open their mouths, the birds open their beaks and sing, the griffins whistle, the lions roar and thrash their tails, and meanwhile the visitor has to prostrate himself. And when he gets up, he cannot see either the emperor or the throne.
Finally, he discovers that the throne has somehow risen way up, and the emperor is still sitting on it, stiff, painted, but now wearing another costume than the one he had apparently been wearing a moment before, and certainly too far away to hold a conversation. The man is not just impressed, he is befuddled. He is dominated by all this splendor. He agrees to fight for the Roman Christ and for the empire. He will be kept happy by presents, honors, subsidies. He may be given a Byzantine princess in marriage. He will certainly be sent a bishop who is subject to the Patriarch of Constantinople and who will sustain imperial interests. The Byzantines and their emperors understood well that diplomacy is cheaper than war, because when it works, your enemies do your fighting for you. And even when it doesn't work, it helps to buy time.
But all of this needed money, a lot of money. In the 3rd century, remember, the imperial administration of the United Empire pretty much broke down. Inflation sent prices rocketing sky high, and the economy of the empire threatened to regress into a system of barter. But then in the 4th century, reform restored the value of money, and taxation was re-established, which could be used to keep up a bureaucratic government. This saved the East, but it couldn't save the West, which lapsed back into a barter economy under its barbarian rulers and grew weaker and weaker because it could not pay to protect itself. The eastern part of the empire, however, was safeguarded by firm administration and stable economy, which bolstered its diplomacy and enabled it to pay its soldiers with gold.
The East's ability to tax enabled it to maintain a highly trained army and navy which could preserve the empire. War for Byzantium was a desperately serious business. So the Byzantines kept and developed strategies and practical improvements in a way that barbarians and later lords of the West cared little about. The Byzantines developed drill, they developed tactics, they also developed secret weapons like Greek fire, a petrol-based mixture rather like napalm that could be shot from ships and from battlements. It proved deadly against Arab and Slavonic fleets. And they did great things with small numbers. This medallion commemorates the triumph of Justinian's general Belisarius, who reconquered North Africa from the Vandals with about 15,000 men and Italy with only about 8,000. By the 10th century, the grand total of Byzantine military forces was at most 140,000 men.
But there was one institution that was even more important to the survival and the unity of the Byzantine Empire than the army, and that was the church we now call Greek Orthodox. Greek because Byzantium had been an ancient Greek city and its successor Constantinople inherited its Hellenistic traditions. Orthodox because it alone in its own eyes represented correct doctrine. The Church's faith became the bond that in large measure took the place of a common nationality. And its position in society was crucial to the state in ways that the Latin Church in Rome never was. We shall see why and how in our next program.
Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching. For information about this and other Annenberg CPB programs, call 1-800-LEARNER and visit us at www.learner.org.